welcome to the book launch presentation. And this is a duplicate session that I did lunchtime today. And it's lovely to see over the course of both sessions today, there's been a lovely, fantastic mixture of people from practice, policy and research. And it's just lovely to have you in this space with me this evening. So this is the Bush book launch around understanding abuse in young people's intimate relationships. So I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Ceryl Davies. I'm a researcher and a lecturer based at Bangor University in North Wales. And I've been working on research now for nearly 15 years now. And this is the focus of my research area around focusing on gender-based violence and abuse and violence within family settings and also within intimate relationships. And some of the work that I published around this topic have been kind of practice-based articles, more academic-based articles, and then those really practice-based serious case reviews, which are looking at some of those recommendations to practice development. And this is me here, a picture of me in my old kind of office when I worked as a senior manager for Gwynedd in North Wales. And this is the day when I kind of completed my PhD and it was ready to go. So it was a very happy day. And just to kind of give you a feel around my interest in this research topic, my interest really came out of work that I completed when I was working as a service manager for the Youth Justice Services in North Wales. And the work that I did around building wellbeing interventions, and I led on an wellbeing group work for young people who were working with the criminal justice system. And what I found was that wellbeing issues and relationship issues was a really key factor for young people, which really kind of ignited my interest in looking at this issue specifically for young people, and then more specifically during this research project for young women. And then here is my PhD journey, because this book is a development from my PhD study. And on the left here, you'll see the picture of me registering for my PhD, beaming with happiness, with my daughter at the time in her buggy, with her favourite blankie, which I may add is still her favourite blankie. And then on the right here, this is the day I graduated from the University of Lincoln, which was a fantastic day. So this is very much a journey for me, and writing this book during COVID and bringing the young women's stories and voices to life has been so important, because this research is very much, and this book is very much grounded in the voices of young women and their lived experiences. And whilst the focus of this presentation here isn't really to take people through a detailed research study or methodology, for example, I'm more than happy if any of you want to have a separate discussion or a coffee over Teams to discuss any aspects in more detail. That's never a problem. But I think this research, as I mentioned, was very much co-produced with young women. And even though I was really lucky to get a scholarship to do the PhD in the University of Lincoln, this is very much North Wales research. So this is Welsh research that was completed bilingually to inform the messages in the book. And those messages and stories in the book and discussion, and also the practice model that's discussed in the book, are very much applicable across services in the UK. So for me, being a native of North Wales, it was really a privilege to be able to lead on bilingual research, to be able to use that research from our beautiful North Wales to inform the messages for research, practice and policy, which are outlined throughout each chapter of the book. So I'm just going to give you a flavour of the research outline and then some of the messages from the themes from the research. But this was research specifically with young women aged 15 to 18 years old across 7 secondary school and also including the Youth Justice Services in North Wales. And what was really important for me was that this research, as I mentioned, was co-produced with young women. And it was co-produced throughout the research. It wasn't co-produced through maybe one-off sessions. I worked with 2 groups of young women from separate secondary schools in North Wales for a period of a full academic year. So from September right until the May, June. So right until that exam period. And the young women provide invaluable advice around what they thought of the research, the questions, and all the tools that I completed as part of the research. Because the research and the messages in the book include evidence from questionnaires with young women, but also interviews with young women, really kind of in-depth interviews looking at those lived experiences. So that's the kind of research summary, just in a nutshell for you. But also just to kind of reiterate a key point around this was research to collect the lived experiences of young women. And that was a conscious decision because there's very much limited evidence on a global basis around the stories of young women, around their intimate relationships. So really a lack of qualitative research. So what I really wanted to focus on was having that really specific gendered space to discuss this topic with young women and for young women. However, whilst I most definitely acknowledge that abuse in intimate relationship is a gendered issue, so when you're looking at global evidence, young women, when you're looking at impact, prevalence and severity over time, suffer a much higher degree of abuse than young men and men. And indeed, figures and recent figures across the UK illustrate that young women up to the age of 24 are the group most at risk of intimate partner violence and abuse. So for me, that was the rationale for selecting to focus on the voices of young women. However, I'm also very much of the view that anyone can be a survivor of abuse within intimate relationship, irrespective of your gender, your ethnicity, your social status, your culture. Anyone can be a survivor of abuse. So I'm also of the view that young men and men can experience abuse within intimate relationships. And for me, as I'll kind of link into the statements at the end of the presentation, for me, young men and men as a whole need to be incorporated to be part of the solution to addressing abuse within our communities. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly kind of touch upon the research context. So the research context for me was very much driven by the work that I'd done in the Youth Justice Services, but also this was in the period after the UK definition of domestic violence and abuse was offered by the Home Office. And this was a non-statutory definition and was the first definition to really address coercively controlling behaviour, but also address that young people aged between 16 and 18 could also be seen as a survivor of domestic abuse. So that was part of the context here for me. Also, some of the other parts of the context was quite an emergency policy debates around sexualization, sexting, online abuse, for example, and also that broader discussion at the time around healthy relationship education. But for me, one thing that I really, really wanted to address throughout this research and also to inform future publications was around looking at evidence around the continuum of abusive behaviour. So what I really wanted to focus on asking the young women was around when you're dating, when you're in a relationship, who has the power? Who has the control? Who makes the decisions? Who decides if you're going on a date, where you go? Who pays? Who decides what you do on those dates? Who decides when you're exclusive in your relationship? Who initiates and decides your degree and level and frequency of sexual intimacy? So for me, I really wanted to look at those power and the control and the decision making within relationships, to then be able to also kind of investigate that kind of broader idea of the continuum of abusive behaviour. And I really wanted to measure the attitudes, because here for me, attitudes can function as what I call like a breeding ground for unhealthy relationships and also in abuse. If you've got those attitudes which are supportive or justify abusive behaviour, then those attitudes can then fester and grow kind of that broad continuum and acceptability towards a broad continuum of everyday abuse, including kind of harassment, catcalling, upskirting, groping, and emotional, physical, and sexually abusive behaviour. So that was the research context. So I'm just move on now, just to touch on the themes from the research, just to give you a flavour of what I found from the research, but also a flavour of the discussion within key chapters of the book. So the key aspect of what I want to discuss was around the relationship discussion and those power within that relationship. And what became very clear was this idea and the overarching influence of gender, and the influence of gender or gendered social norms on relationship and the relationship scripts. So just to kind of touch upon, in summary, what I found overall within the questionnaires and within the advisory groups was that young women could really describe what a healthy relationship looks and feels like. They could describe how they felt empowered, and they could really describe what they feel isn't okay and what's okay within relationships. So they had the knowledge, they could really kind of explore this in detail. But what was interesting then, even though that was the overarching finding from the questionnaires, when I went to talk to them and did that in-depth conversation and discussions around their relationship experience, that kind of mask of equality around gender norms disappeared, because they weren't able to kind of bring those attitudes to life in their relationship, because they didn't have that kind of influence and power and control. So then during the stories and their experiences, a lot of the young women kind of reverted back towards those gendered stereotypes around femininity and those expectations of you as a young woman, and actually the pressures on you as a young woman, but also equally some of those expectations and pressures on young men. So, for example, the pressures on young men to be hypersexual and the pressures of young men to be masculine. And what that meant and looked like for the young women was that the young women felt that to be attractive and to have that ideal body image, they needed to have big boobs, shapely bum, and a slender waist. And that level of attraction that they measured was based on that kind of really successful girlfriend role. And they described in detail through their different stories, which is really built upon in the book, around how they feel that young women, to be successful, they need to be that selfless and passive girlfriend to make their relationship feel together and also to feel special. And then on the other side, if they weren't successful really in meeting those aspirations or their perceived aspiration of intimate relationship, the impact of that was that they felt that young women can go into a psycho girlfriend mode, or young women can go crazy and weird. So they were painting this picture of those young women who were more challenging or who were questioning the power and control as really being the not successful girlfriend or the unsuccessful girlfriend. And then, as I mentioned, the consequences of not being successful was not being wanted. And the impact of that was that often the young women explained that they would be not part of the conversation, not part of social activities, not included and ostracized. Indeed, one young woman, Claire, described that she was in a group, a friendship group, and she described there was 12 of them within their group, 12 young women. 10 of them were kind of dating, had had relationships, and there were 2 young women within their group who hadn't. And she described that how those young women now were not becoming part of the conversation, and who were kind of being left behind or not included. So there was this sense also of being included within that conversation. And then this idea around the impact of intimate relationship progression. So, as I mentioned before, the aim here was to really unpick those dating norms. The intention for me in the discussions and the conversations with the young women wasn't really to directly ask about abusive behaviour. The aim for me was really to understand the etiquette, the routine, the expectations, their experiences of dating, and then to follow on with their experiences of intimate relationships. But what was interesting was that most of the young women who kind of came to meet me and came to be interviewed and built that relationship with me really wanted to discuss key questions that they had around the urgency to discuss sexual intimacy. So a lot of the young women had things that they were concerned about, things that they were unsure about, and things that they wanted to really, really check in with me because they felt that as a researcher, because of the ethical boundaries, they could ask questions and that would feel okay. It was a private and confidential space. And for me, as I'll mention later, that was a key learning because that illustrates gaps in support and services because obviously young women and indeed young men um, should have a space where they can discuss questions around sexual intimacy. But what was also apparent during this discussion was around quite a high level of discussion on sexual consent. And this idea of once you've had sex once, do you then always have to have sex, or can you say no and can you take a step back? And the pressure that they often felt, and often that level of coercion, especially if sexual intercourse was instigated by the young man that they were dating or in a relationship with, was that urgency to have sex. And the consequences if they didn't want to have sex, and they described that and framed that as Ellen does here around if I don't have sex with my boyfriend, then he'll sulk, so I just have sex with him. And then Michelle was describing how she'd been dating someone. She wasn't in a relationship with him, and they'd kind of been dating and they'd been discussing the prospect of possibly having sex. But then she felt that when he did instigate sexual intimacy, that she just felt it was fair enough. But when she was describing the experience, it wasn't really something that she wanted to happen at that stage. So it's about kind of understanding these experiences and understanding the consequences of this on young women, but also the way that Alicia framed this was around, well, boys feel trapped in relationships. They're laid back. They don't like to be nagged because it's kind of annoying. So she was justifying quite a lot of the abusive behaviour she was experiencing by her older boyfriend and kind of framing it within that gender normative. So it's okay because he's a young man. It's okay because he's masculine. And then that kind of relationship checkers. So as I mentioned, one thing that was really important for me was to really check that who decides when you're exclusive, who decides if you're going out, or as they were describing with me, when you're talking to someone. And that kind of reference to when you're talking to someone was that kind of build-up of that initial kind of dating stage. So lots of framework of justifying and naturalizing some of these quite abusive behaviour, and in particular of concern actually around sexual consent. And then that second theme was really focusing on gender double standards, and a lot of the stories of the young women, as is kind of highlighted throughout the book, really, is focused on those gender norms and sexualization, and indeed that kind of level of coercion. But the young women describe experiences similar to walking on a tightrope, where if you fall one side of the tightrope, as mentioned and described by several of the young women, you're identified, you're labeled, you're stigmatized as a slag or a slut. And then on the other side of the tightrope, if you're not responsive to advances, you're not dating, you're not in a relationship, then you're ostracized and you're labeled as being frigid. So a lot of the experiences shared by the young women were really within a space where it was very difficult for them to navigate that territory. And what they were describing was it was very uncharted territory for them around really being able to make that choice, have the support, and kind of to know, oh, what side of that tightrope will I fall across, and can I possibly stay in the middle on the tightrope? Um, so they were mentioning and discussing those experiences, but also they were really mentioning that kind of pressure to really maintain and subtly perform their feminine role. And the consequences if they didn't was that they were often judged. And that judgment escalated to quite a high level of street harassment, but also online harassment. And the young women kind of also described was that if they didn't conform to a certain kind of attractive status or body image or role, then they would be judged. And there would be quite a lot of, again, as I mentioned, catcalling. So it was very challenging around some of the stories that they were describing, but the way that a lot of the young women kind of addressed that was to be subtle and to really kind of control overtly their sexual identities. Um, and when I went through all the transcripts from the interviews with the young women, what was really quite heartbreaking, from a perspective as a woman and as a mother, was that the most commonly kind of referred to words throughout the interview was indeed slut and slag. So that's how they were kind of judging and describing that judgment space that they were in from others. And indeed, that was something that was often perpetuated by the schools within the environments of the schools. That sense of if they kind of wore a specific kind of length of skirt, or if they had specific makeup that wasn't kind of approved of, then they would have that wet swipe and would be asked to remove all that makeup in the classroom. And then, as I mentioned, around that idea around sluts and sexuality, really describing some of those experiences within the street space, within the community, within the classroom, and also this frequent reference to boys talking about sex quite often, but also rating sexual conquests in lessons in a visible and open way, and also online. And what was interesting and what was being kind of the picture that was being built here and is discussed in the book is around this overt and explicit abusive behaviour. So very different to what we know from abuse within adult intimate relationships, which is very much hidden, stigmatised, and is very much underreported. What was very different here with young people was it was something that was really visible within their environments and within their communities, online and offline. And it was something that was often kind of perpetuated and condoned in front of peers as well. So I think that's an interesting learning here for preventative work. And then just the final theme around the nature and the patterns of abuse. Um, it's around looking at those different experiences that the young women shared around abuse online, face to face, and also abuse kind of across the school environment, as I mentioned. And this idea of those broad spectrum of abuse around being reserved to having sexual intimacy, really feeling under pressure to undertake specific sexual acts that they felt really uncomfortable, and had really kind of voiced that that wasn't a choice and they didn't want to undertake those specific acts. From really, as Jennifer's story in the book is highlighted, her experiences of having her sexual intimacy discussed very openly within the sixth form common room without her consent, and that kind of open discussion around their sex life and the consequences to her of those discussions, to that idea of and this was a common theme as well, of the consequences of not adhering to the wishes of their boyfriend, from what I discussed earlier on of not being a successful girlfriend, to also a very common theme was the consequences of their partner or their boyfriend or the boy that they were dating being in a mood. So this then decision that they would choose to fit in and whether or not that choice was informed or something that they felt was pressurized or coerced upon them. So it actually wasn't at all an informed choice, was really a challenge. And the consequences of that, Ellen's story, really highlights that consequences on her emotional, but also her physical well-being. And the consequences for her being quite a long-term abusive relationship that she was able to provide rich reflections on because this relationship had ended. And a common theme across the stories was that the ability of the abilities of the young women who'd been in relationships that had ended was that they could reflect in more detail on their experiences, but that consequence for her of being isolated, alone, experiencing physical disabilities and emotional well-being issues as well during this time, and because of the isolation that she'd felt from her family and her peers. And then just to touch on social media, one thing that was very interesting was, as I've kind of mentioned, and this was a kind of a golden theme throughout the discussion, and is a golden theme throughout the book, was both that surveillance across social media, but also the presence of lad spaces or lad Facebook pages that really not only was the spaces around rating sexual conquest and sexual body parts within the classroom, but also there were online forums that did that as well. And this really kind of normative response to these young women receiving constant requests for nudies. So that request for what they called nudies were pictures of different body parts. And some of these requests that the young women were describing were from young men and men. And some of these people requesting the nudie pictures from them were people that they never met, some of them. So I think also there's that messages for sexual harassment and abuse of women on a broader community space as well. So just to kind of summarize, what was key was this quite often go-to of naturalizing, normalizing, and justifying this abusive behavior. But also within this space, and quite discussed in detail in the book, was the presence and the impact of gender inequality and socialized gendered social norms on both the role of young women and also the role of young men. Because as I mentioned, this was a space created for young women and the messages for research on young women. But what was evident also through the observations and the works with school, that for some young men, that pressures to be hypersexual, hypermasculine, and also indeed to be heterosexual is a key factor that is a challenge to young men as well. But that kind of overarching attitude and environment around the need to accept male dominance. And that idea, if you don't, then you're being a typical girl, you're being emotional, you're being a psycho girlfriend. And then this idea, oh, boys don't have any shame, so that's okay. Yeah, again, that kind of excusing. And then the impact of that, going right from building those attitudes within community that really supports these gender stereotypes, supports kind of this broad spectrum continuum of everyday abuse, is that escalation. And that escalation often led to physical abuse, sexual coercion, harassment, and also overarching emotional abusive behaviour. So that escalation can be seen in the young women's stories. And as I mentioned, one thing to be mindful as well is this idea of the peer influence. And the peer influence here was seen as being supportive, and there were examples of peers being supportive, but also there were examples of abuse happening openly within spaces, with often peers kind of perpetuating that abuse, peers really and kind of often quite the whole classroom, really perpetuating that bullying, that harassment, that coercive, that controlling behaviour, and that questioning. And Michelle was describing of how her sexual experience had then been discussed openly in front of the classroom, and she would be shouted at in front of the classroom around those experiences. She would be judged, she would be labelled. She would respond to that by trying to laugh it off. However, the boy that she'd been sexually intimate with was being seen as being a lad. So the different in double standard was becoming very clear through their narratives, experiences, and their stories. And sometimes the young women who I spoke to was able to see this visibly, and sometimes it wasn't seen or labelled or named as abusive behaviour. And again, as I mentioned, indeed, there was lots of examples of experiencing and coercion and abuse for young women, but there was and indeed that public humiliation of young women, but also there was that discussion around the experiences and the pressures of young men to be up for sex, and that questioning for young men: have you had it yet? So have you had sex yet? So moving on to the final stage of this presentation now, and kind of just touching on the model, the practice model that I've developed as part of the book. And for me, the whole community approach, I go into quite a lot of detail around this approach in the book. And a lot of the research that I'm doing, that I've previously done or that I'm doing currently, focuses on quite a lot of impact on policy, but also more importantly for me, practice. And that's probably the practitioner in me, that's the social worker in me. Because for me, it's really important to look at, well, okay, so what does this evidence, what does this research mean to impact and influence and change practice on the ground? So here is a new practice model that I've developed, which is discussed in detail in the book. And it's really highlighting this form of abuse as a social public health problem, and also as a whole community approach. Because for me, everything that I learned and measured and discovered during the research really supports that this is something that needs to go beyond the whole school approach, and something that should be addressed from an attitude and also an impact basis throughout the community. But it also needs to be understood at a community level in a bespoke way. So it needs to be understood based on the local population needs and the intersectional needs of those communities. So for me, building that whole community approach plan needs to be really kind of, if you like, person centered or community centered to that specific area. And it needs to be a whole community approach based on multi-agency, working in a coordinated way, that really fosters that kind of ethos of working through a community of practice, which is really that interface, and that space where you're looking at that community based on research, evidence, and also messages for practice. So moving forward for me, there needs to be that model of work, which I've just discussed, kind of operationalized at each level of practice, right from when you're addressing this issue on the ground, when you're assessing the issue, risk assessing, and when you're offering that space of support, that needs to be that flexible, active listening space. It needs to focus on those structural inequalities from a high level kind of really strategic point of view, but also you then need to have that whole community approach that looks at the nitty gritty here, as I've discussed within the way forward, and those really practical kind of based tools as part of the model. Because for me, if we're going to kind of really change the support and the education for young people within our society, it needs to change some of our schooling discourse around gendered social norms and how we socialize and reinforce male entitlement and female passivity and sexual double standards, how we reinforce those attitudes supportive of gender consumption of these roles or stereotypes, to kind of educate, support, and empower our young women to operationalize the attitudes that they obviously understand and have, but we need to give them voice, power, control, and tools to be able to say no. And this is what they asked me to put in my recommendations. We need the scripts, the support, and those kind of really active listening, critical friends to be able to really provide us with the support to say no. Otherwise, we're shamed, um, and we're judged. And that kind of idea of the overarching support, as I mentioned, for me was really apparent during the urgency for them to seek kind of support from me as an university researcher. And then those recommendations really link with the discussion there, which are really discussed in really detail throughout the book, in particular towards the final chapters of the book. And as I mentioned, for me, a key learning here is the overtly display of abuse within young people's intimate relationship, and that we need to begin to remove some of those barriers so that young people can access support. And we also need to look more creatively at what this support looks and feels like. So, for example, the young women were discussing, I really don't want to go and discuss my relationship with a school nurse because I'll wait in the queue in the corridor, and then by lunchtime there'll be gossip about me that I'm pregnant. And then they were describing, I really don't want to go and see the safeguarding lead for the school because that's the deputy head. And I really don't want to discuss this level of kind of questioning and curiosity and sometimes this concern that I have around sexual intimacy, which, let's face it, is an uncharted territory for young people with a deputy head. So we need to look at the nature of that support. And then I'm just going to end with Glyn's story. And Glyn was a young woman who was very savvy. She was 15 years old. And I did in-depth interviews with her, which were all really interesting. And she was really a ball of energy and a positive young woman. And she was describing herself, oh, I'm weird because I challenged some of these young men. And she described that she'd received a message from a young man asking for a nudie. And she got the message and laughed it off and saying, I'm not sending a nudie to you. I don't even know you. And then the request had come back saying, oh, no, come on, just send me a nudie. So she'd gone up to the bathroom. She'd put a sponge in the bath, took a picture and say, here's a nudie for you of SpongeBob. And then she felt really savvy and she was really animated when she was describing this story to me. And then the request came back saying, ha, 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 send me a picture of nudie. So she then went and peeled an apple, took a photo and said, there we go. That's a picture of a nudie of an apple for you. Now do one. And she explained, I could tell him to do one. I felt really savvy. I felt really confident. But then what was interesting when I was really analysing the conversation that I had with Glyn was then she was going to describe of, do you know what, I'm okay. I'm not really judged. I don't get too much harassment. I'm not really called that many names. I have respect because I haven't done anything. And the advice that she was giving me was, be subtle. If you're subtle, you're okay. Which really kind of provides that picture of Glyn describing her experiences of constantly being subtle. Oh, I won't do this because I'll be judged. I won't do that. I won't be judged. So being in a kind of that invisible cage and being subtle to avoid that kind of bullying, that harassment and that abusive behavior. So please feel free to kind of email me anytime if you've got any questions. I've also got a list of publications there related to this topic if you feel that you've got any interest in doing any further reading. And also here, there is a flyer with a discount, 50% discount off the book if you're interested in purchasing the book at all. And also here, I have further information. You're more than welcome to register your interest, no pressure, or to get in touch with me. This is a new course that I'm developing through Bangor University, which is going to be a 6-module online course. And a copy of the book will be provided for all those people or those prospective students who register on the course. The course will be led by myself. And it will be a course focusing on how you bring to life the whole community approach to address abuse within young people's intimate relationships. And indeed, some of those messages that can kind of, and some elements of the model as well, to be honest, that can kind of transfer to wider patterns of abusive behaviour within the family as a whole. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm just going to stop sharing the slides. And then you're more than welcome to ask me any questions that you wish. Hopefully that made sense. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions. No pressure, guys. But yeah. Yeah, Mannon?
Thank you, Ceryl. I thought that was really, really interesting. And, as somebody who has a teenage daughter myself, it's kind of worrying, isn't it, really, that this is going on, and we've experienced it ourselves as well, haven't we, really? But that's what I was going to ask at the beginning, really, and you've said this a few times tonight, that girls today appear more savvy, really, and they're aware. But then it's concerning that even though they are aware, they will still kind of conform to the stereotypes, if you like, and that's worrying, isn't it, as a society? But
Yeah.
my question really was that, is there did you see a social economic difference in terms of how girls and young women respond?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's a really fascinating question. I think going to your first point, around kind of the power and kind of having that knowledge, for me, that's a key aspect of preventative learning, because I think prevention sometimes has included going into schools and giving information to young people around
Mm,
what a healthy relationship looks like, what abuse looks like. And they could tell me everything. They could even give me the list of the websites where they would go and have support. They knew all the information. That's by no means
mm,
am I not saying that they don't need to have that information shared again, but
yeah.
I think that young people need something different. They need the tools and the skills to respond and to use that knowledge, if you like. And kind of going to your kind of question around that social economic element, I did measure the free school meals. That was regarded as the measure of social economic status at that time.
Mm,
Um, there wasn't any significant key messages emerging around differences in abusive pattern across social economic status. Um, so that wasn't something that I specifically observed. And I think when I was interviewing the young women, it wasn't a theme that came across.
mm,
So that's kind of quite an interesting finding in itself, that it wasn't a driving
mm,
factor to the visibility and the presence of the abusive behaviour, really. I think a
yeah,
lot of the young women who was observing relationships or observing friends within experiencing abuse, or within really unhealthy intimate relationships, the one thing that I would say is those young women were more reflective, and were able to kind of identify some of the signs and symptoms of abuse. But
mm,
otherwise, there wasn't a key driver there around, what would I say, kind of a factor in the young women. It was something more ingrained, if you like, which is
yeah.
kind of really linking into the solution on why I feel it needs to be that whole community approach, really. So that's an
Mm,
interesting question, and I think those more kind of specific factors could be explored in detail in future research. But I think as a whole, that preventative model around a whole community approach needs to look at that intersection, needs to consider different needs, around
yeah.
poverty, needs to look at ethnicity, culture, needs to look at ability and disability. So for me, that model moving forward needs to look at the diversity of young women. But
Mm,
within their stories, it was very much really rigid and stereotypical gendered social norms. And that was very interesting, because when I was looking at the anonymous responses to the questionnaires, for example, a lot of the young women had said that they were curious about their sexuality, whilst what they were sharing within their relationship was very much heteronormative, and that was seen as the norm.
mm,
Heteronormativity and kind of masculinity and femininity.
yeah. No, interesting. Thank you, Carol. And I'd just like to say congratulations to you on the book. And, you've done amazing. Thank
Great.
you.
Oh, diolch, Mannon. Diolch, Cariad. And yeah, Ruth?
Yeah, no, I echo that completely. That's really, really interesting presentation. Thank you. My question is, you talked about how in the 2013 definition, the age changed from 18 to 16.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on whether it should be, considering obviously you were speaking to young people who are younger than that,
Yeah.
should the definition be lowered to say 13,
Yeah.
to actually include these young people?
Yeah, 100%. I don't think that that definition of 16 to 18 goes broad enough when you're looking at the patterns of when dating and intimate relationship begin. So I think it should be aligned to more of that pattern of intimate relationships, but also that pattern of when this abusive behaviour begins to manifest. And I think it should be named. And I think unless you're naming abuse, then it's not visible. Unless it's not visibly and it's not named, it's excused, it's justified, it's naturalized. And from recent work that I've done with various schools, the issue around gender stereotypes and this divide is continuing and escalating. So I would argue that it needs to be named, it needs to be discussed, it needs to be kind of labelled correctly, and it needs to be addressed. And unless we're doing that on a whole community approach, it's going to continue. So yes, I think it needs to be including young people below the age of 16.
Excellent. That's really interesting to get your view on that. And I asked a slightly loaded question because I've actually got a small project going on at the moment. I'm at City University, and we're doing some work on seeing whether the age limit should be lowered. So I will get in touch with you to because it'd be great to get your, because we've looked at it from a sort of police side of things, which is obviously a much more serious end of things. But just to sort of understand, having your understanding of the education and everything like that would be really
100%. And it needs to be based on also the severity and the impact of that abusive behavior. You know, so if you've got like a 15-year-old, you know, survivor, because if you've got that 15-year-old survivor of domestic abuse and they've experienced it, then for me, it needs to be labelled as that form of abusive behaviour. Of course, that could be linked within a child safeguarding forum, but it also needs to be understood and named in that way. So if you're working with that young person then and supporting that young person, then he or she needs to understand those experiences. And it's only through understanding and having that support that young person will be able to address and move on and recover from those experiences. So for me, I think it's really, really important. And, you know, having worked in youth justice, you know, that age of criminal responsibility is over 10, but there is that protection of when someone is a perpetrator or not around the use of that label. And so I think that work with young people needs to be really detailed and needs to be looking at that different stages of a relationship, which I discuss in the book, across that age span. You know, how dating changes when you're 12, 13, 14 to when you're 15, 16 to then when it really changes when you're 17, 18, 19. And something that this is anecdotal now, but from working across several universities in the UK, something that I've identified, again, this is not through my research, this is anecdotal, is that when young people go to universities, some of those questions, and this has been raised during my teaching sessions, some of those questions around sexual consent are there into young adulthood. So for me, that transition period and support needs to continue, because those questions around that uncharted territory of intimate relationships really needs to be considered carefully.
Thank you.
Oh, well, lovely. It's been absolutely fantastic having you here. And I think, you know, both sessions have been very different and really interesting. And it's just been lovely having you here. And I think it's just been, from your perspective, Vicky, I'd really like to thank you for your support in both sessions today from Bristol University Press.
Thanks,
I think, you know, from both sessions, it's been a really broad spectrum of people who have joined the sessions. And I just really appreciate it. And what I will say is, if you need anything, if you want a copy of the slides, if you've got any questions, you know, Ruth, I know Mannon very well. I used to work with Mannon. So I will see Mannon this week. But from your perspective, Ruth, please feel free, if you want to have a chat or a coffee over Teams, then just ping me an email and we can meet. Never a problem.
That'd be great. I've got funding to organise a conference, so I was just thinking about you for this. So,
sounds interesting. Well, I love London, Ruth. So yes,
excellent.
That sounds perfect. Yeah,
I will definitely be in touch then.
Sounds perfect. Sounds perfect. So have a fantastic evening. Thanks for sharing this space with me. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, Mannon. I look forward to keeping in touch with you, Ruth. And thank you very much, Vicky. I'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ceryl. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.